Okay, we're ready to go. Thank you everybody for joining us today for this great opportunity to talk about this really interesting book that has come out recently. Before we start, let me just begin by expressing my support for the Uluru Statement and recognising the traditional lands on which we all stand or sit for this interesting talk. I'd also just like to acknowledge that one of the greats of international law, Professor James Crawford, has died this week, and his impact on international law, like the panelists today, has been immense. So we'd like to acknowledge his work over many years, and I'm sure that we will see many such tributes like this one to James Crawford coming soon. So let's set the scene for where we are today and then how we're going to run this book launch. We've got an hour and each of these panelists are obviously giants of human rights, and each of them could speak for an hour. Obviously, I'm not going to let them do that. And so what we're going to do is trying to run a moderated conversation. So we're going to, today we're basically talking about the fact that the UN Human Rights Council, and formerly Commission, but now Council, is at a really critical juncture, and with a review slated to begin in 2021. So this book, which we're launching tonight, John Parche's book on the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, a very great enterprise, is intended to aid this process of review. Because it really provides amazing insight into the record of the Commission and the Council since the inception of the United Nations work in human rights in 1946. It describes a lot of the issues that were taken up, the modalities developed over the years to address these issues, and the measures taken more recently by the Council during its last 15 years of existence. And basically what the book does in many ways is present a mixed assessment. There are no shortage of critiques of both the Commission and the Council, but there are also many achievements. And so what we hope to do tonight is to canvass some of both of these. So let me introduce our panelists, and then we are going to go into questions. So first of all, we have the author of the book tonight, John Parche. John has had a career in human rights which has spanned over 50 years, and he's worked in a wide range of organisations, international, regional, national. He began his career with the United Nations on the 3rd of January, 1966. So for a moment, stop and think about that. He basically began his career largely before there was much international human rights law, as we now focus on it. There was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Genocide Convention. But the international human rights law that we really focus on today, also John has basically seen through in his career in human rights. He's headed many, major organisations, including being secretary to the Commission on Human Rights, the coordinator of the Vienna World Conference on Human Rights, and he has a very long association with UNSW, where he is a visiting fellow with us, and he is also a board member of the Diplomacy Training Program. Professor Megan Davis is the Pro Vice-Chancellor, Indigenous UNSW, and the Barnow's Chair for Constitutional Law at UNSW in the Faculty of Law and Justice. Megan also has a long record of work within the United Nations system, and she was elected by the UN Human Rights Council onto the UN Human Rights Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous People in 2017 and continues to serve as a United Nations expert. Megan's a Cobble Cobble woman from Queensland, and most recently, as part of one of the leaders of the Uluru Statement, accepted the Sydney Peace Prize for the Uluru Statement. She also supports the Queensland Cowboys, but no one really cares about that generally. Finally, we have the Honorary Michael Kirby, who we could spend the hour talking about his leadership and achievements in these fields. And he has a very long, and perhaps the longest list of this panel of legal appointments, including most recently, obviously, as a Justice of the High Court of Australia from 1996 to 2009. I'm just going to simply skip over Michael's entire career and focus on, in particular, his relationship with the United Nations. He has a long history of working within and for the United Nations in many different aspects. And some of the more notable most recently are heading up the chairman as the Commission of Inquiry on North Korea, He was a member of the UN Secretary General High-Level Panel on Access to Essential Healthcare. And he is also an honorary professor at no less than 12 Australian and overseas universities. So he certainly trumps everything else on the panel in that way. So let's begin with a question to John, and then we're going to have a discussion about the book. And John, perhaps you can hold up the book, because you've got the hard copy right there, so everyone can see this book. And everybody today who's listening into this can actually get this book online for a 30% discount today. It's my job to spruik it. And I was neglectful at the start in noting that I'm Justine Nolan. I'm the director of the Australian Human Rights Institute at UNSW, and we are co-hosting this seminar with the International Law Association, and Professor Natalie Klein will close the ceremony on behalf of the International Law Association. So John, this book provides a really comprehensive account of the UN's treatment of human rights through the lens of the Human Rights Commission and the Council. Can you just give us a little bit brief insight as to your motivation for writing this book?
Thank you very much, Justine. I would like to, first of all, share my sorrow at the passing of James Crawford. But more closely to this book, to that of Garth Netheim, and a few years ago, Garth was very instrumental in encouraging me to do this book. The book, which happens to be here, is the reason. One of the reasons the other day somebody showed this end of it as well, just to make sure you're warned about it. The book covers all issues. Modestly speaking, it covers all issues. There's no issue that has been tackled between 1946 and 2019 that is not mentioned in the book with references. And that's the whole purpose of the book, because it gives the reason I actually decided to develop this book was because I couldn't find any other like that. And when I taught, or when I consulted, or when I was approached by various sources, media and so on, including in some mediations I had the privilege of undertaking, there was no such instrument, no such tool. So I set about putting it together, and to my surprise, I finished it. So we now, and that is why it is important to understand that it's really a tool, and that's why it goes up to 2019, even though it refers to the Commission and the title. One quick remark there. The book has an underlying, if you like, not skepticism, but kind of warning about not erring into assessments of whether it's very good or very bad. If you notice, the cover has the ceiling of the Human Rights Chamber, but underneath is a boatload of refugees, of asylum seekers. They happen to be in the Mediterranean area. And the idea is to warn the reader that it is not just a recital of the achievements, as it were. It's really trying to point out what happened, and that's why there is this reference to the. I think it has about 9,000. How many? It has about 6,000 footnotes, and those footnotes cover about 8,000 or 9,000 documents. So it's backed, and the book shows where you can get these documents very easily in several languages. So it's a handy tool in spite of its appearance. It looks bulky, but it's actually very, very, very usable, very user-friendly. I think I'll stop there.
Sure. I mean, so let's get into the book a little bit, and we'll bring in Megan and Michael in this discussion. In the book, you couch the historical, development of the UN's treatment of human rights through the lens of the Commission and the Council as this very great enterprise. It is this, but I guess at times from the outside, to some people, it feels less like a great enterprise and more like a house constantly under renovation, with things being added, things being cut, and changes being made. In fact, Eleanor Roosevelt, one of the architects of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, has basically said that, life is made up of this series of adjustments. And this also seems an appropriate way sometimes to describe particularly the Human Rights Commission. And so if you were thinking about over the years all the additions and renovations that have been made to the Commission and perhaps the Council as well, what might be one that you consider its finest? Like what was the change, or what was the particular additive that was made to the Commission that you would highlight? And then I'll go to that same point to Michael and Megan. John.
Right. Well, the process has been a kind of gradual one, but not a consistent one. You know, the Commission, incidentally, those words are not mine. The very great enterprise are the words of Henri Laugier, who recruited John Humphrey, who actually recruited me into the Secretariat in '66. And that's why I put them in inverted commas. I try not to express opinions, but going through the various quite exciting phases, and I use the word exciting because they are exciting, I think is the reforms of Kofi Annan between 1997 and 2002. Kofi Annan is the only, and perhaps the only Secretary General who really focused on bringing human rights to the foreground. And in these reforms, he actually set the stage for what happened later, as it were, in terms of incorporating human rights into the UN system. You know, in 1994, for example, human rights set out its first field office, which was in Cambodia, following the presence of the UN in the transition in Cambodia. There are several things happened around that time, not least because of the perestroika and the end of the Cold War. So I think that if I had to advise any reader to understand what's happening today, one should go very closely into the reforms of 1997 and 2002. The result of that is that there is a UN presence in all Security Council operations. There is a mainstreaming process which is still going on. I will underline this by a qualification. You have to understand that the UN, like many other institutions, is a bureaucracy. And so human rights has always been a kind of not unwanted child, as it were, but sort of looked upon with suspicion. We were lawyers there, and the only other lawyers at that time were the legal office, and they kind of looked upon us as troublemakers because we indulged in sensitive issues. Kofi Annan broke that stigma, as it were, by putting us straight into every single committee that he established to advise him on issues, on any issues relating to the Secretary General, especially on peace and security. It also coincided with the activities of some of the rapporteurs on the Congo and so on. So there was a generalized evolution going on, but I think the landmark is 1997 and 2002. Don't forget that is how our human rights got into the Millennium Development Goals and into the Sustainable Development Goals. Whether that's a good or a bad thing is a matter we can discuss, but certainly thanks to that era, human rights is where it is today. Having said that, I must caution against excessive optimism, as it were, but I think it's in the right direction and it's constructive and a good development.
Human rights lawyers can rarely be accused of having excessive optimism. So we'll allow you perhaps a little bit of optimism. And let me just remind the participants that if you would like to pose questions as we go along, we'll have time at the end, but I'll try and also feed them in. So please post them into the Q&A, not the chat with it. So Michael, if I turn to you in terms of thinking about some of the greatest achievements of either the Commission or the Council, what would highlight, what do you focus on in that area?
I'd like to start, as you did, with acknowledging the life of James Crawford. He was a good friend of mine and a commissioner of the ALRC and a great Australian and a believer in human rights. I also, in the presence of Megan, I acknowledge the Indigenous people, our great unfinished human rights challenge in Australia. And it's very important that we never forget that and never forget to acknowledge the Indigenous people of Australia. So far as the challenge that the Commission and then the Council addressed, John is very modest, as his long experience has taught him it's prudent to be, but he was there during what I think was the most important development, which was the creation of the special procedures. The special procedures arose out of the terrible suffering that occurred in South America, particularly in Argentina and Brazil and elsewhere. And that ultimately led the United Nations to take a step that would be a practical step of getting some very intelligent people to work to the United Nations and to secure the information, the details, the evidence, and to place that before the world community and say, you cannot ignore this. And John Pache, it was such an important figure in all this. I mean, he hasn't mentioned really, there's no time, his enormous work. But when I was Special Representative Secretary General Boutros Ghali in Cambodia, it was very difficult. It was very difficult dealing with the royal government of Cambodia. And Hun Sen would not speak to me. And it was impossible to get any progress. And so I went to John and I said, what can we do to break this impasse? And he got a committee together and he invoked the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, who flew out with John Pache to Cambodia. And of course, he could not be ignored by Hun Sen. And the discussions began. A practical way was found to restart the dialogue. And when there is a dialogue, there can be progress. And the progress isn't perfect, but we now have a mechanism which makes for this progress, and it's very well described in this book, and it's a wonderful book. And it's going to be a book, John, when all of us are gone, people will go to your book and say, here is the history of a great enterprise. It had to begin somewhere. It began with John Humphrey and Eleanor Roosevelt, but a very big part in a very great enterprise was played by you. And therefore, this is a good thing that you have prepared this book. Would have been a labor of love and a tremendous work load, but it's a most precious volume of a noble moment in the history of humanity. And we must never forget that adjective, noble. And I would apply it to you and to the great enterprise that you describe.
And thank you, Michael. And the wonderful thing about this panel is that the United Nations generally, to so many people is this abstract organization that appears like this massive bureaucracy. But all three of you have had a very intimate relationship with aspects of the United Nations. John in particular, being there, almost since the birth of the drafting of all of the laws, etc. But all of you have been involved very intimately with the organization, and you don't get to have that discussion so much, because so many of the critiques of the United Nations often come from people who have very little interaction with its work. So before we get to some of those critiques, Megan, if you were picking sort of one of the finer aspects of the Commission or the Council, what would you focus on in terms of its development?
Thanks, Justine. Can I also just acknowledge James Crawford? I'm very good friends with his daughter, Rebecca Huntley, and just want to pay my respects, of course, as an international lawyer. Growing up in Australia, he was, one of the main scholars that we would read and talk about and talk to. So I just want to acknowledge that. I also just want to quickly, sorry, Justine, to acknowledge John Pache. When I was a little kid, when I got a UN fellowship and flew to Geneva, John will remember, to Palais Wilson. It was my first time out of Eagleby, Logan City, never been on a flight before. I remember the safety demonstration flying to Geneva on British Airways. I wrote it down on my hand so I wouldn't forget. And I remember going to sleep thinking, I must take off my nights. I must, in case the slide come out. Anyway, I got there and one of the first guys to come and say hello to me in Geneva was John Pache. And it was marvelous because he remembered all the Aussies who used to work there in the old days and the contribution that Australia had made, the really heavy lifting Australia made in terms of the drafting of the UDHR and the ICCPR and ISESCA. And, you know, we forget about that heritage, you know, about the really important work that Australians did. And so, you know, one of the first things he said to me was, "What's up with Pauline Hanson?" And then we had a yarn about, you know, how it's so at odds with Australia's commitment to human rights in the past. So that was really wonderful and made me feel at home. And he's been my friend ever since. And also just want to acknowledge Justice Kirby, who, you know, when I was at law school, again, in the days where nobody really, you know, when you're an Aboriginal law student in my day, no one cared. And it was hard. It was tough. I was at UQ. And I remember when they taught us, when native title came in, and one of my lecturers said 5 cents for native title is 5 cents too much. You know, Michael Kirby was someone who spoke to a lot of us who felt a bit out of the in crowd at law school. He made us feel okay to be at law school. And I just want to acknowledge him, because from the expert panel to referendum counsel, he's always been so kind to me and supportive of me. So I just wanted to make that note. Justine's like giving me the wind up, so I'll get to the question, which is
I haven't even started yet, but I'll give you.
I'm utterly obsessed with the Commission on Human Rights. So I was so excited about this book from the moment John, you know, initially suggested it and when it came in. And that's because the Commission on Human Rights in my field, which is Indigenous peoples and international law, did so much heavy lifting that everything that exists now in human rights and international law, insofar as Indigenous people's rights, emanated from the Commission on Human Rights. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. I won't go through all of the items right now, Justine, in terms of what it did lead to. But in terms of, you know, this notion of a great enterprise and the legacy of the Commission on Human Rights, there's no greater, you know, demonstration of that than the fact that Indigenous peoples went to the UN and said, "Here we are," you know, and the UN was like, "We don't really know who you are." And so one of the first jobs they did was to set up a kind of report, actually, that investigated the many dimensions of who Indigenous peoples are as a rights-bearing group who are appealing to the UN for fundamental human rights protection. And that Commission on Human Rights work just paved the way to everything, including the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So I know John was a large part, Julian Berger, there's a lot of UN bureaucrats who are a very large part of that work. As John says, it is a bureaucracy, and that's the thing that you find out when you become a UN expert and work on the UN side, that the hardest part about human rights work within the UN is that it is a bureaucracy. It functions like a bureaucracy. It acts like a bureaucracy. And, you know, we know Hilary Charlesworth's written this fabulous book about rights ritualism, which is something bureaucracies do. But you can never, I could never overstate just what the Commission on Human Rights achieved in terms of Indigenous people's recognition and rights across the world.
So I want to go to the future in a moment, because this book also, you know, not only talks about what has happened, but also, you know, a vision for where things might go, which John is setting out in this book. But before we do that, I just wanted to sort of acknowledge that, you know, there, as I said at the start, there's no shortage of critics around the UN and the work of human rights, you know, with some arguing that the commission itself was never fit for purpose. The way it was designed, you know, it had aspirations that it didn't achieve. So if I was to throw each of you back to 1946, and you were then designing a body that was going to be the premier body for human rights in the United Nations, what might you have done differently if you were setting up the Human Rights Commission? John, let me start with you.
If you look at the first chapter of the book, you will see the discussions that took place in regard to the structure and format of the commission. And there was serious discussion as to whether it should be made up of government representatives or experts. And it nearly swung towards the expert option, but it didn't. And frankly, I think it's appropriate that it didn't, because you need to have governments at the front desk to be accountable for their policies and their, as far as they relate to the human rights of people, really. But my feeling, and this, however, has gone to one extreme, because now the council has developed what I call a stockade mentality, where the governments are trying to kind of monopolize the entire spectrum of activity on human rights, and therefore they have missed out on the oxygen. Between the Commission and the Council, there has been a very clear, among other trends, a very clear trend in trying to keep in civil society out of the mainstream activities. And therefore, it would have been much better in 46 to have had civil society implanted into the structure of the Commission at that point, because this way it would have been easier to maintain it. As it turns out, the history of the Commission reflects enormous positive activity by civil society. Many of the treaties, for example, the Torture Convention, were actually drafted by NGOs. The Racism Convention, again, came in the subcommission, not even the Commission. So it's a very big problem, actually, and I use the word carefully, that today we have the Council risks atrophy by eliminating or reducing civil society input to them. It gets worse. But anyway, it would have been better had we kicked off on the right track in 46.
That's a great point. And Michael, just let me twist it a little bit to you, because we've got a great question that has come in that is adaptive on this point. And we actually have a question from another Australian who has played a great role in human rights and also in the United Nations, Chris Sidoti. And Chris basically asks the question to you: did the Human Rights Commission deserve to be killed off? Did it need to be killed off? And is the Human Rights Council any better? Michael, would you like to start with that question?
Well, can I just get in the answer to the first question before it passes?
Sure.
And in fact, in 1946, and this is all told in Paula Gerber's book with Melissa Caston on human rights law in Australia, there's a story about the Australian delegation and Jessie Street and the Dr. Evatt as the head of delegation, and what they did in the UDHR and all the other steps. But it reminds me that in May to June 1948, the drafting committee included Colonel William Roy Hodgson. Now,
That's right.
Colonel makes it rather off-putting a bit, because you don't sort of think of it, but he's described as peppery, aggressive in manner. And that even makes it even worse. But he was speaking to his script, and his script was written by Dr. Evatt. And Evatt said, we have to have a judicial branch for this enterprise, and we have to have a court. Now, at the time, that seemed to be crazy stuff. But, you know, with the development of the European Commission and then Court on Human Rights and the Inter-American Court and the African Court even, we now see that that wasn't a crazy idea, and that Australia's support for a court was really quite a good idea if it had been planted. You'd have to have some sort of special leave procedure and some limited jurisdiction, but to have made things justiciable would have been a good step. And Australia was advocating that, but the other great powers didn't want to go down that path, and it was very adventurous at the time. Now, so far as the Commission and the Council, I reported to both. I reported to the Commission for Cambodia when I was Special Representative as Secretary General. I reported to the Council when I was North Korea. They gave me two easy jobs, the jobs. I think the aim, of course, of going to the Council was to make a more respectable body that would not include serial offenders against human rights, but there was a problem with that anyway because of the veto power in the Security Council, which effectively meant you had to try to get the permanent members in there. So I don't think it was a bad endeavour, but it hasn't succeeded, and we've seen some pretty horrible countries taking some pretty important roles in the council. So did it succeed? No, it didn't succeed. But all of this is a journey. We're on a journey. This is like Runnymede. We're back in the earliest time of trying to create the institutions. And I certainly agree with what Megan said about how terrible the bureaucracy can be and the arguments over petty cash. But in a big organization, you've got to have proper accounting, and you've got to, when you sit back and take a glass of water and accept the fact that it's not going to be a perfect system, you realize that it's got to have the institutional mechanisms. And sometimes it works, often it works. And I found it worked in Cambodia as far as it was possible, and it worked in North Korea as far as it was possible. And the story isn't over, and it's continuing. And so I think we've just got to recognize that this is a matter of Runnymede. We're at Runnymede, and we have had the privilege of playing a part there.
So Megan, onto that original question around if you were back in 1946, John has highlighted the need to more firmly implant civil society into the mechanisms of the United Nations. And Michael has talked about the need to have a more clear sort of a justiciable angle in relation to it. Would you have done something, one of those, or something different if you were designing the human rights mechanism at that time?
Look, I'm just one of those people who always say, you know, it is what it is. It was what it is, and certainly for Indigenous peoples, it worked out well. But I think the Runnymede analogy is a good one. If you think about how Indigenous peoples got into the UN system, it was via the really important network and work of civil society in Geneva at the time, and particularly around non-discrimination. And so I understand that point, and I'm not sure. I feel like I'm not sure the Human Rights Council system, particularly the UPR, has really nailed it in a way that I would think is, you know, really gives voice to what it is that civil society needs to offer to the UN system, particularly around scrutiny of state conduct on human rights matters. But that's not the question you're asking. So in terms of the CHR, it is what it is. I mean, I think I'm not sure when I reflect on, you know, it's been a long journey. I mean, when I started at the UN, I was 20 and I'm now like 45. So I'm a bit like, you know, I've seen the CHR in operation. I've seen the Human Rights Council in operation, and you know, there is a lot, because of the nature of the bureaucracy, a lot of you know, what's the word, ritualism, I suppose, to use a Charlesworth term, around the way in which human rights are dealt with by the council and by the UPR. And so whether or not that is an improvement on the CHR, I'm not sure, because I think the point was made that a lot of the criticisms that have been sheeted home to the CHR are the same criticisms that are sheeted home to the Human Rights Council. And in some ways, Justine, that returns to your initial point about, and something that you and I talk about in the hallways of UNSW law a lot of the kind of theoretical, academic, scholarly criticisms of the UN, a human rights system, and the council are okay to make, you know, if you're a desktop academic and you're just looking from the outside, which is the bulk of the people commenting on it. But if you're actually, you know, somebody in the system who needs to benefit from the system, it's a very different story. Yeah, so you can do a very lengthy history of the Enlightenment and whether or not that matches up with what the UN stands for, and then look at the human rights system and, yeah, criticize it for all of its faults. But for so many people within that system, it has been emancipatory for some, and it has led to really important human rights gains and freedoms for others. And I think in and amongst all of the very clever scholarly work that's done on this, That is forgotten too often about what the UN does for people out there, grassroots people on the ground, in terms of their lives and their needs and what they need in terms of freedom to do and freedom to be. We don't talk enough about that. And I think the CHR has, set down a very important foundation for that work, however imperfect it is, right? Because you can always run a ruler across things and point out what the negatives are and where it doesn't work. And people are ready, the academia, PhDs, newspapers, they're full of those examples. But very rarely do we hear about those examples where, this is what you and I talk about, Justine, one of the most emancipatory acts in Australia was the incorporation into domestic law of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Yeah, it was really the actual formal end of the reserve admission period, the Protection Acts. We can never underestimate the impact of non-discrimination upon the lives of Aboriginal people in this country. And so that, I think one of the things that comes out for me in John Pache's book and the CHR is that the work that they did on Indigenous populations and kind of identifying who they are and what their issues are, is it had a flow-on effect, John. It had an impact upon all the treaty bodies, right? Who started talking about Indigenous peoples when they never used to. And so you saw CERD incorporate all of these really important observations in terms of their norms and their normative framework in Indigenous people's rights. I mean, we'd never seen this before. And all of that happened because of the CHRs, the attention that they took to bear on Indigenous people's rights. And as a consequence of that, and the treaty bodies are going, okay, well, let's say what we have to say about these Indigenous peoples. The CERD and the RDA, the flow-on effect is actually really significant in our country for our people.
And could I add to Megan's statement?
Sure.
Indigenous people have been a very important frontier area for the Commission and the Council. But so has the issue of LGBT rights, queer rights. And in countries where 70 countries where this is still unlawful, you've got the world community with an independent expert who is assisting it and insisting that they face up to these realities. We're at last catching up with the science relating to sexual variation in the human species and other species. And the United Nations is a vanguard in this area and is pushing this forward with lots of resistance and so on. There's not enough in your book about queer rights, John, and that's probably because your book is historical. And it shows it's still growing, that the process is still growing, and it's growing in areas of gay rights, and that's a very good thing. And I can say, in countries that are really horrible and cruel and lethal and killing and hatred, here is a body in the world, the whole world is coming together to listen to people speaking out and speaking up, and that's a wonderful thing that I have lived to see.
And that's going to be in volume 2 of John's book.
Well, there's bits of it already in there, as it happened.
There's a bit.
Yeah, because that's when the book ends is when the emphasis on LGBT rights started to emerge in a serious focus. But I when you let me have a minute, Justine, let me know.
Your minute is right now, and
Okay.
you respond to some of Megan and Michael's comments. And can I also just pose one question that we have from the audience directed to you as well? This one comes from Ben Lee, and it says, as a former secretary of the Commission, the role of the secretariat has been essential in guiding adherence to rules and to the development of it. Particularly, how have you seen its role change from the transition from the Commission to the Council, and how influential do you think the secretariat is today? So perhaps so you could work that in as well as a response to the issues that you and Michael have raised.
Sure. Let me just say how moved I am by what I have heard from Michael and Megan, and I'm really, I guess at my age, I shouldn't be so emotional, but I am. But let me, the secretariat, Ben was always a very good student of mine, by the way, when I taught at UNSW. He is now a very important diplomat in the Australian Foreign Service, and I'm very proud of him and others who have taken on and others which I see, who I see on the list of participants. That is also very touching, I must say. The secretariat, let me address, I think Chris, one of the questions said, was it the right thing was to kill off the commission? Commission was never killed off. There was a transition. The council is a kind of remake of the commission. But to express my personal opinion, I was very disappointed at the end of the World Conference in '93 that the commission did not transit at that time. I felt that was the best time for the commission to transit to something more, if you like, honed on hands-on experience, hands-on expertise, if you like. And as a result, with the creation of the High Commissioner in '93, starting in '94, and the commission still kind of lurching on the momentum of its previous years, and then the introduction of the council, that has created a kind of the word of sorts between the office of the High Commissioner and the council. The role, the mandate of the council and the mandate of the High Commissioner needs to be seriously refined in order to make them complementary and more effective. The secretariat, as you probably know, I was in charge of special procedures when they were first started in 1978. For 10 years, I headed, and at that time, the secretariat was a kind of ad hoc secretariat, like the inquiries were. So we need to really formulate our own procedures as we went along. And we borrowed a lot from the petitions committee of the Trusteeship Council, for example, to allow us to legitimize the presence of individuals at the normally the place where governments only sat. So in order to investigate, to hear testimonies and so on, we borrowed procedures from other bodies. We needed money because we were not part of the budget. So we had to go to the budgetary authorities. And that's where the other part of the secretariat were used for political purposes to try to undersupply mandates that were not liked by some governments and oversupply those that were liked. So we had to play a kind of role of being fair to everybody, but also effective. And it was really, it posed a very big burden on our shoulders. May I also say that during my career, I presented my resignation twice. And each time, fortunately, it was refused. At the third time, I was threatened with being fired because of advice I gave the chairperson of the commission in regard to procedures in the commission in regard to one big country and one small country who were having a go at each other. And the ambassador came and told my boss to fire me right away, or they would fire him. So there are many. So the secretariat acts as a kind of buffer, as a kind of shock absorber. And I was told in my early days, you have to be very discreet and very anonymous. Now, I think I succeeded in being anonymous because sometimes I don't even remember who the hell I am.
That's the perfect diplomat, no?
And anonymity and discretion, of course, that's part of the job. There's no point in adding more, what's the word, confusion to the built-in. It's a miracle that the human rights enterprise has survived in the UN system, I can tell you. And I'm not surprised that it is in the state in which it is now, but we should take that as a challenge as to how to improve it, really, because the elements are there.
So can I take you up on that? Because we are nearing, I mean, we're not even, we can't even touch the sides of your book in this hour. And particularly with these, you know, with all three of you having this great history with UN. Some of the questions we've had come in particularly talk about the future of the United Nations. And I know there's a blueprint in part in your book in relation to this, John. but sort of very briefly, sort of in our, sort of our last 10 minutes, Megan, if you were looking at specific reforms for the future, what is there one that you would highlight and focus on? And then I will come to Michael and back to John.
Oh, that's a tough question, Justine.
And I'm giving you, say, maybe 2 minutes for that. Yeah.
I don't know. Look, there's just too much to say here, Justine, as you know, because we talk about this too much. Where do you start? I think.
What about part of John's question, John's issue about sort of reforming, from a General Assembly body to a charter body? Is that an issue, or is there a particular reform that you think comes up more than others that is needed?
I mean, I think that would make a difference. I do, structurally. Absolutely. I mean, I think so there's that structural issue, and whether that could, as John knows, whether you can get that across the line. I'm just laughing, as Michael and John would know, just what it takes to just get a change to an agenda. It's just a nightmare. It is this huge bureaucracy, and as I said, that's one of the barriers. And I think if I'm just thinking about some of the granular criticisms of the Human Rights Council, which I think are fair, there are things that need to be done, I think, that need to be done to improve the efficacy of it in terms of human rights scrutiny. So take the UN expert mechanism that I'm on. Part of our World Conference reforms, and the reforms that did get passed by the GA, are around avoiding doing what treaty bodies and the Human Rights Council do. So we were very upfront about needing to take a less carrot and stick approach to rights enforcement with states. And so we've taken a much more kind of mediation approach, which, in all fairness, there are areas of the UN that are active in this space in terms of peacekeeping, but we really play a very a mediation role between states and Indigenous peoples, or big business and Indigenous peoples in resolving disputes. So we're not quite as black and white and carrot and stick as the treaty bodies are, or really the HRC. I mean, even the UPR was set up in a way to avoid that kind of carrot and stick approach, but it's been played by the states. The states always work out a way around having to be scrutinised on these matters. And I think Hilary Charlesworth's book is a very good book that explores the very early kind of ways in which states sought to get around the kinds of things that the HRC was trying to do. So I don't know, Justine, there's so many answers to that question. But I think what we've found with our new mandate that sits under the Human Rights Council is that we're able to change legislation on the ground. We're able to influence different negotiations between Indigenous groups and the state and, other private entities such as tourism operators and others, just by coming in and offering that advice and taking that approach. So I think there's room. So structurally, John's point's an important one. And then just in terms of the methodology of the enforcement of human rights, we need to innovate and find ways that we can do it in a way that states can't game it and avoid it.
Michael, what would you prioritise on this question around reform, structural reform or otherwise?
Well, I'd like to build on what Megan has just said, because I think it's inevitable. Each of us looks at this enterprise from our own experience, and no one has more experience than John. He's seen the whole thing. He's the eminence grise. He's seen the whole way it works, all the cogs and whistles and so on. But in my work on North Korea, we had the problem that this was a state that wouldn't allow us in, that wouldn't deal with us, that clammed the door shut, wouldn't debate, wouldn't do anything. So we had to make it difficult for them to ignore the issues of human rights. And that's why we had public hearings. We had to encourage the media to be involved. We recorded the public hearings. We put them online. We had very powerful witnesses who came and told unforgettable things that you just couldn't ignore. And the result of that was that it was a sensation, because that's not the way careful bureaucrats normally prepare the case and present it. And we presented it in a way, we effectively said, we defy you to ignore this. And I think if it were done more carefully and effectively, that is the way. We got huge votes in the council, the Human Rights Council. We got huge votes, people who'd never voted together before in the General Assembly. And we even had the issue of North Korea referred to the Security Council, which never looks at human rights questions if it can avoid them. And why did that happen? It happened because we had tremendously powerful human testimony of great suffering and wickedness that had to be addressed, that the world could not turn its back. And I think if there's an improvement in the methodology, that would help to have it's like an unput-downable book, which John has, an unput-downable challenge. And I think that's something that the system should look at to improve the power of the testimony of human beings about wicked wrongs that are being done to them. And that's what I do. Look at Russia today. They acknowledge the Gulag. They condemn it. The Germans are ashamed of what is shown of what happened in the Third Reich. And we've got to, as it were, present objective facts that demonstrate the universality of the human rights of every human being on the planet.
Thank you, and well said. And John, we're giving you the last minute before I hand over to Natalie to sort of, you know, one of the things you prize is structural reform in relation to this. And do you see that as a key to the UN sort of moving better, the UN Human Rights Council moving to a stronger position in 10 years' time?
Oh, definitely. I think the council should be open to all member states. In fact, it's an essential factor because no state is perfect and every state needs assistance and support. And if they're going to be accountable, they have to be sitting at the front seat. They shouldn't be, and we should eliminate this kind of distraction of a kind of beauty contest leading up to the elections to the council. It's totally unnecessary, a deflection. The flooding of NGOs into the council through GONGO, as they are called, government NGOs, should be addressed. The book suggests some form of chamber for that purpose. Networking among human rights organizations has started very well and needs to continue in order to be able to strengthen the input of civil society. So two things. One, to make sure that the council, the future council, is a permanent body. The argument that it's difficult to amend the constitution is not as effective as it is when it comes to human rights, because human rights is not only in the charter, there are 5 articles where it is mentioned, and also it is among the fundamental principles of the organization. And the charter has been amended before. So it is not a credible argument to say that you cannot have a permanent body as charter body because it's difficult to amend the charter. What is necessary is the political will, and that's where governments have to face the challenge. The second point is the insertion of civil society, which would include business, by the way. I think business is now running most of the human rights aspects in the world today, instead of governments, or rather, you know, behind governments or in front even. And business must have a much more accountable position in human rights accountability issues in the immediate future, I would say, using COVID as a platform to start from.
Thank you so much. And I know that we have not even touched the sides of the book, which will encourage people to read it, because you really need to read this book to understand this much broader discussion. And I also haven't got to all the questions that have come in, but I know that John is a very accessible person. So if you have posted a question and many of them are very specific and you would like an answer, shoot an email to me and I'll forward it to John, and I am sure he will respond to you on those. So email your question. My email's online at UNSW, and I'll forward it to John and put you in contact with him. But on that, I'm going to hand over to Professor Natalie Klein of UNSW and the International Law Association to close. Thanks, Natalie.
All right, thanks so much, Justine. And I couldn't agree more in terms of only just touching the surface of what Michael described as a precious volume of work. It's an extraordinary piece, and we're so fortunate to have had the opportunity to talk about it with you and with people who know so much about the great enterprise and warts and all and how it's working. And I think everyone can follow in what Michael says about the constant need to sort of speak up and speak out. I think that's always critical when we're dealing with so many of these issues. So it's been really fabulous to have had the opportunity to hear from our panelists this evening about the book. So really on behalf of both the International Law Association and the Australian Human Rights Institute, really sincere thanks to John, Michael and Megan for their comments this evening. Thank you to everybody who has attended and for their questions. It's been a really fabulous opportunity. And yes, there is a 30% discount on John's book. We will continue to spruik that. There was a question about how to get the discount code, and we will send an email to everybody who is attending the event to let you know how to access the code and be able to make the purchase. So you can delve into these issues. And John, I hope you've seen there's a few requests about what's going to be in volume 2 for you to think about for the future as well. So let me close here again with a note of thanks, and look forward to seeing you at future events as well. So thank you all.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Michael,
Thanks for the book.
Megan, thank you.
Thank you, John.
Justine, thank you so much.
Thanks, Justine.
Very, very kind of you. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.